Hello, everyone. So good to be here. My name is Simon Ratcliffe, and I'm a score mixer, and I mainly deal with games and films. I'm not a coder or anything like that. So this is really a much more of a look at some of the creative elements for how we can be using object-based audio with a focus on Dolby Atmos and object-based embeds audio in games and in films and other media as well, just to really kind of get stuck into some of the really creative elements of how we look at binauralization. So today we're going to be looking at difference in practical mix and sound design applications and the behavior of beds and objects. Because, I think one of the things which kind of falls off is that, we get very caught up with the speaker-based side of things. But of course, when it comes to the vast majority of consumers, especially on the game side of things, it's very much headphone-based. And a lot can be done to really push things in terms of storytelling, and it's really having a lot of fun in terms of sound design when you look at how you can treat beds and objects differently in terms of how they're treated binaurally. We also want to have a quick look at the difference between a creative binaural encoding such as Atmos and binauralization of content for monitoring. I think sometimes there's a lot of people conflate the two. And then some tips and tricks for acoustic and electronically generated sound. I'm going to encourage you to plug some mics in at some point, not today, but in the future. And then a couple of pitfalls as well that we can avoid. Things that sound really great on speakers, but just really don't work on cans. So just to clarify the second point, this is a screenshot of Virtuoso, and this is not an object-based or Dolby Atmos or anything like that system. This is purely a monitoring system. I find it extremely useful when I'm not in the studio, if I'm going somewhere else and I'm on headphones, just to go, okay, well, I was working on this in an Atmos system. I'm on the road now. I'm going to use the software to binauralize where my speakers would have been, and that is not what Atmos or object-based audio is. And I think sometimes when people look at Atmos and things like that, they go, "Oh, okay, great. I'm using a binauralized setup." But what the binauralization in Atmos and object-based audio is doing, of course, is figuring out a way of taking a creative element in a mix, which was speaker-based, and applying that in a way that our ear can go, "Okay, I can hear that source element," as opposed to recreating a room monitoring environment. So I'm sure a lot of you know this already. However, it is marked for beginner and intermediate. So I thought I'll just quickly do a very quick rundown on the difference between beds and objects. So a bed, simply put, is a gang set of 10 objects in a channel-based or fixed pan configuration. So left, right, surround, and so on. And then the two overheads. Bed metadata is set per ADM, which is the master file. And within all the beds within the ADM have the same setting. And then, of course, that's really very popular for things like ambiances and ambience type effects. Acoustic recording arrays are often used in beds as well. Objects, on the other hand, they have free movement through the immersive space. So don't think of it so much as, oh, it's going through that speaker or this part over here. The headphone way of thinking is actually much more pure in a way because it's the entire immersive environment. Objects can be mono or stereo or wide channel. So you could create a 704 or a 906. So that would be 4 overheads plus 7 speakers as a monitoring environment, or 9 speakers plus 6 overheads, which sounds counterintuitive when you think of it as a 360. But that nice thing about the Atmos part of it, the headphone binaural part of it, is that it doesn't address it as if it was speakers. It just addresses it as if it was a room. Objects cannot be sent to LFE natively, and of course, you wouldn't really use low frequency effects or a sub-channel for binauralization anyway. Each object has its own binaural metadata setting, as well as a size setting where you can increase or decrease the size of just the object. And they're very popular for sound design assets and solo instruments. I did a horror film a while ago, which was really cool because you'd have like singing voices and things like that in a theater or on headphones suddenly coming at you out of nowhere, which you can't really do in a discrete channel-based setup. So Looking at the Atmos binaural metadata, again, I think a lot of the time we get so caught up with how it sounds in a speaker environment, we forget that it's really, for many people, about the headphones. So the way we look at beds, you got, as I say, it's global metadata settings per session. Each bed channel can be set individually, but all the beds share the same. Sorry, each bed channel, should we rephrase, can be set individually. So the channels over here, but each session has a single bed setting, so it's global. And then I refer to something called Dolby's mullet, which is not a Dolby Labs endorsed haircut. That has more to do with their original recommended idea of, okay, we're going to emulate a listening environment, so you'll have the front speakers near, the side speakers mid encoded, and then far for the rear, for example. The objects, each object has its own binaural setting, and it can be independently panned, and it can be independently resized. And the nice thing about that is that you can move it then through space, up or down, or wherever you like. And the resizing causes decorrelation. Now, a big thing that I'm talking to you about today is the difference between the two, why beds and objects really do work very well together, and the advantages of having both. I think some people get very caught up in using only one or the other, but I think that they both do very different things, and they can do very different things. And the fact that objects resizing does decorrelation is one of them. A couple of things just to remind ourselves, in terms of binaural behavior, like really, I mean, I'm not going to tell you about HRTF. You guys know how that goes. But HRTF, spatial coding, and getting features of the immersive mixes stand out on headphones, I think are really key things just to remind ourselves about. So when you're approaching a mix or even a composition, it's a good thing to think, I'm, for example, not going to put a piano right behind someone's head because it's not going to sound very good. So with that in mind, just a quick reminder on head-related transfer function. The physical restraint of the fact that we have two ears and a big, in my case, a big fat head in the way, means that we have certain aspects of sound which are time domain and frequency domain dependent, but then it hits your head, that it rolls off in a particular way. We also have relatively poor perception of direct sounds behind us. In a speaker setup, you can get away with it. Headphones, it really, honestly, often sounds like it's in the front, but just with the high frequency roll off because of the transfer function of the EQ. And then, of course, relatively poor perception of height front to back. Again, speakers, you can kind of get away with it, but there is actually very limited precedence effect on overhead. We have not evolved in such a way that we really rely on what's happening above us in terms of sound. And then, of course, the second thing to bear in mind, and these are all things that will really go towards how you mix things and how you record things, is the fact that we are dealing in ADM files, which are pretty huge, but of course, up to 128 objects, the first 10 of which is a bed. But of course, those get really kind of crunched down or quantized, if you like. So, for example, in the left image here, we can see the way that you have all these blue objects, which are within the sound field. On the right-hand side, you see once it goes through spatial coding, it gets dithered down and stuck together, so you go, we're going to split it out into regions. So, and that's because you can have up to 128 objects, but at the end, when it's streaming, it's only going to be coming out of a maximum of 16 possible objects. And that also applies to all the game systems. Early game consoles were only 8. The more recent ones are 16 objects, and that includes Xbox, especially PS Labs. They've been putting a lot of effort into this kind of thing, but PC as well. Fmod, for example, already has ways of dealing with this part of it. So knowing that it's going to be stuck down like that means that you can have it gives you a good idea of how to treat the audio going forward. So creative uses of the differences of the binaural behavior between beds and objects, I think, is really, really key to look at. So I like, for example, segmenting the room into quadrants. So decorrelation of live mics is something which locks nicely into that. I'm going to explain each of these on further slides. establishing beds within an ADM as an anchor to establish a sound rule. So, for example, if we are encoding mid, near, far, or off in the front and mid and far, if you then have something which breaks that rule in terms of audio, that can sound really, really cool. So if, for example, you have a very lush ambience, and then and that's set so it's mid and far, and then you've got a single object that's near, like a synthesized object or a voice again, that's running through space, you are using the anchor of the bed to really separate it out, which is very effective. And then, of course, I really do encourage you to worldize or reamp, if you like, audio, because one of the nice things about Atmos, of course, is in a standard stereo environment, it's there's limited use or limited kind of let me say not use, but reverbs. I think a lot of the time we go, okay, we'll just put a reverb on something and place it within there. Whereas if you have just even a pair of speakers in a basic room with a couple of microphones, you can really get a lot of early reflections, or the original term for early reflections being dimension, just by mixing even like basic mics. Even by mixing a couple of those elements in, you can get enormous differences when you're dealing with binaural encoding. So, for example, including bottom mics, there aren't bottom objects, but your brain can go, it realizes, okay, I can hear that because there's a source here and a source at the bottom, even though it's still in a 360 space and there aren't, technically speaking, objects down there, your brain is able to calculate that there's a difference. So it makes certain things feel higher and lower. So here we go. Creative use of different binaural behavior, establishing a room or a bed rule. As you can see on the left, we've kind of looking at it as a segmented cut-up kind of room. So even though it's a full room, it does, I think, a lot of the time work well to separate the room into these quadrants, including the top. So just like the earlier picture I showed you, you can go, oh, well, okay, great. We're going to maybe not have too many things clustered in this area. And then on the right-hand side, this is a very typical binaural bed setting that I use. If it's for post-production, you're probably going to have left, right, and center on near. But for music production, I personally prefer it to be off. But now that's established a rule, which means that we can break the rule. So over here, if you look on the left again, on the left side, you've got the lighter green. That would be, for example, if you take the green as the dimension of the room, the lighter green would be a more near or mid binaural encoding. And then the darker back of the room would be a more far binaural encoding. And then by having the red object that I mentioned earlier being near encoded, it really helps it stand out. And that's not something you would even really notice or you wouldn't notice at all on speaker playback. But on headphone playback, it helps separate that thing out. So with that in mind, a couple of things that I like to do is segment the rooms when it comes to recording for, say, film scores or game scores. I'm lucky enough that I get to work with a lot of orchestral composers. I'm going to show you a clip later, but this could be just in a basic studio or even in your basic room, and it doesn't have to be anything as elaborate as this. Even just having 2 or 3 microphones, just basic microphones, closer and to a source and further from a source, and then attaching those into an ADM such as this will really, really help create a sense of depth. So this, however, you can see is very much linked to the right column where you can see, okay, I understand why you've got Omni mics there. And I have treated the microphones not to try and get all the audio, but to likewise segment the audio into sections like I did in the previous slide. So, for example, figure of 8 microphones on the side will reject things on the front, and we get more of the reflections or the off-axis sound, and then even more so for the supercardioids or hypercardioids on the rear. that's going to mean, okay, that part of the playback is really segmented away from the front. So and this all comes down to decorrelation. We want it to be different. So this is a kind of a more complete version of that. This, if you'd like to take a grab of that QR code, which I'll also post on the Discord later. This is something called Echo Project, which we're involved in with Air Studios. And there were 8 arrays where we experimenting with different ways of dealing with recording specifically for immersive, recording music for immersive projects such as games. Okay, so mix tips and tricks, in-the-box mix ideas, because you're probably thinking, well, this is great, but I don't have access to an orchestra. Once again, even if it's a harmonica or if it's your voice or if it's a single guitar, these things all work for that as well. Don't worry about it just being for larger recordings. But some things that are quite handy on the mix side is, I mentioned object size decorrelation. Now, the nice thing about that is, unlike in a bed or behavior in a non-binaural encoded environment, if you resize an object, it has the benefit of decorrelating around the channels very close by. Now, that may not seem like such a big deal. And in fact, generally speaking, I really avoid it because it can create a wash. But if you are trying to feature something, just resizing it briefly allows your brain to go, ooh, there's something tasty there. And the same thing for fast side panning. This is something which I very much picked up from Srijesh Nair, a colleague who works for Avid. And what he does is quite clever. If he's got a tactile interfaces, he takes a pan and he clips it to the tactile and he just like touches it almost randomly every so often so that things on the side wall pan in very slightly just to catch your ear once again. Wide object effects buses are another good example. So if you've got a cascade of effects in the, and then you put them through a wide AUX or a wide bus, such as 706 or 906 or what have you, that is a really good way of then having discrete objects in the sound field. And then if you then have that inverted in some ways, so for example, to a bed. So if you have a bed equivalent or another wide bus, let's just say that one's mid or far, and then you have the effects, the delays and things like that near. Again, it creates that tension and breaks the illusion. So for example, an FX matrix would hit your ear quite differently, such as this one. Over here, starting with the crystallizer and ending with the filter freak, we have just a selection of plugins that I like to use to create stutter effects. And this is a good example of, okay, great, I've now taken something like this and I've placed it into a different binaural environment to the source. So it will immediately stand out. And again, these are all things that help make, in my opinion, the mix not sound like a total soup when you're trying to squeeze a lot of content into just left and right headphones. What to avoid? Things that are great on speakers, but kind of suck on headphones. Again, rear placement has very poor fidelity. So right behind you, we had in this echo thing, we had an example which was I'm glad we did it, but because of the way the recording was done, the piano was in the rear. And it honestly just sounded like it was in the front, but with a really not great high EQ that just rolled off. Because of course, that's how HRTF works. It's going to adjust for the back of your head. Your brain just isn't good on headphone-based playback at figuring that out. Back to front. Another one would be mid-stage panning is poorly represented. Right down the middle. It doesn't sound great. It just sounds like it's mono, but just a different kind of EQ mono, if you like. And it's even worse on the overheads. So that's why it's generally a good idea to be sticking to the walls when you're panning as much as possible. And of course, I mentioned issues of precedence and locality. Your brain can't pick up something exactly where it is. There's a reason why when there's an ambulance behind you that you have to tilt your head around to figure out where it's coming from when you're driving somewhere. So if you'd like to take a screen grab of this one, this is a proof of concept mix I did for masters I was doing a while ago. This was a film I had actually previously worked on. Funny enough, it was also, this ended up being on the list of Beyonce's references for Cowboy Carter, a South African language film. And if you'd like to take a screen grab of that, it'll link you to a kind of proof of concept mix to see how far I could push the synths. Trying to figure out what is and isn't in good taste, if that makes sense. It's part of the research I was doing. And then for this one, I'm going to play this one for you now quickly. This is a game score in stereo Atmos. This is from the game Guild Wars 2. This was the 4th X-Pack. I've been lucky enough to be working with these guys for the last 4 years. They were, especially on the PC side, were one of the earlier games to really go in for the object-based and Atmos music side of things, which was really a lot of fun. So I was very, very lucky to be working with them for the last 4 years now. So yeah, I'm just going to I'm going to kill this presentation, swap to my renderer, and we'll give it a quick listen. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start it in stereo, and I'm going to swap between the straight up stereo version and the binaural version. Okay, please tell me if you can hear. Did you guys get that? Okay, great. Here we go. There we go. I think hopefully you can hear, especially on things like the stutter effects and the voices in particular. And also the surprising thing for me is the low end, how much bigger the low end is. It's if you'd like to do some ABs of your own, if you want to grab that QR code again, I will also put that in the Discord as well. I'll just play the end so I don't have OCD. There we go. I hope that was fun, and thank you so much for attending. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much. I hope I was okay for time.